We're on Daf Mem Dalid, and we are analyzing whether or not you can accept the chumros of two different shitos, as the Gemara understood in the case of Rav. And the Gemara says here, if somebody takes upon himself michumri beit Shammai u michumri beit Hillel, so he wants to go lechumra in both cases, meaning in a case where Beis Hill is l'chumra, a case where Beit Shammai is l'chumra, all of a kosav omer aksil b'choshech holech. So the pasuk in Koheles says that it's a fool in the darkness. Ela ike Beit Shammai. Okay, you want to accept consistently the shita of Beit Shammai, that's fine. Bekuleim u bechumreim. So you accept when they're mekil, accept when they're machmir. Oh, ke Beis Hill, you want to accept Beis Hillel and be consistent. I'll always go with the Shita Beis Hillel. Then again, Bekuleim Ubechumreim. So how could it be that Rav, in the sugya that we learned yesterday on Daf Mem Gimel Amid Beis, would accept the chumras of both Rav and Shmuel? The Gemara first points out that before we get to try to defend Rava, we have to address the following question. Agufa kasha amrit li olam halacha kidivrei Beis Hillel. We always accept Beis Hillel. And then, Hadatani, later on, it says in the same brisa that harotza lasos kidivrei Beis Shammai yasa. Now, as if to say that after you've paskined straight across the board, always like Beis Hillel, we'll see that that was based on a Ramakol, a Baskol. Now, the Brisa says if you want to go like Beit Shammai, you could go like Beit Shammai, lo kasha. Kan kodim Baskol, kan li acher Baskol. So before the Baskol came out to announce that we always paskin like Beis Hillel, so then at that point, you could decide that you want to go like Beit Shammai. But liachar Baskol, once the Baskol established that the halacha is like Beis Hillel against Beit Shammai, that's an absolute final ruling, and therefore, at that point, the Brisa would have to concede that you have to go with Beis Hillel, you don't go with Beit Shammai. Ibraisema, af liachar Baskol, I could even tell you that it's after the Baskol, but not everybody agrees that we rely on a Baskol. This is Sugya in Bab Metzia, famous Sugya on Daf Nun Tes of Tanur Shalach Noi. And Rabbi Yeshua says, even after a Baskol comes out and announces the halachas like Rabbi Loza, Rabbi Yeshua declares, Lo Bashamayim Hi. We don't pay any attention to a Baskol. Anyway, Mikol Makom Kasha. So let's go back now to the difficult position of and rule of Rava that accepted a chumrah of both Rav and Shmuel when they're mutually exclusive. You can't have both. And now the Gemara is going to have to reinterpret Rava. Amar Rav Tvus, Kula Kirav Avda. So you put a comma after the word Kirav, Kula Kirav. And basically, the Gemara is saying now that Rava accepted Rav Shita. And Rav Shita, if you recall, back on Daf Mem Gimel Amid Beis was with regard to Turbatz HaVeshet, that the Turbatz HaVeshet is considered part and parcel of the Veshet. And therefore, if there's a Nekev B'Mashahu, it's a Treifa. So now, we're going to ask the following question. In the case that came of a Tura, meaning an ox that was owned by the children of Mar Ukva, and they began the Shechita in the Turbatz HaVeshet, and then they finished in the Veshet itself. Now, if you're going to go with Rav Shita, since they started the Shechita in the Turbatz HaVeshet, then it would mean that the Turbas HaVeshet, according to Rav, is part of Shechita, because it is identical with the Veshet. And therefore, according to Rav, certainly the animal after the Shechita would be kosher, and yet Rav paskin that it's treif. So now even though Rav accepts the sheet of Rav, also Rami Bar Yechezkel, when Rami Bar Yechezkel came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, he made the following comment. And again, this is, a typical Talmudic statement. Lo tetzisu lehu lahani kloli dechayil Yehuda achi mishpei Rav. Don't pay any attention to all the rules that my brother Yehuda would say in the name of Rav. Because in truth, says Rav Tavus, says Rami Bar Yechezkel, Hachi Amar Rav. This is the accurate transmission of Rav's ruling. Veshet nisanu bo chachamim shiur. In other words, the Veshet is very long, and the Rabbanan are not going to allow you to shecht the Veshet all the way on top or all the way on the bottom. All the way on the top near the jaw, and all the way on the bottom near the keres, near the keva and the abdomen. Michlal, what do we derive by implication from this reformulation of the sheet of Rav with regard to Turbat Saveshet? Michlal, the Turbat Saveshet lav mokom shchitahu. In other words, the Turvas Habveshet is all the way up on top, like near the throat. They call it the phalanx. And since we've now established that the shear of the Veshet, meaning the esophagus, doesn't go all the way up to the top, and the Turvas Habveshet is on the top, therefore it's outside the parameters of Shechita. And since it's outside the parameters of Shechita, therefore, once he slaughters the Turbat Sabveshet, then even b'mashahu, it's going to be treif. Uka Omar b'mashu. Now you might ask, well, why is it b'mashahu if it's outside the makom hashchita? But Rava nevertheless is of the opinion that even though you can't shecht at the Turvas Haveshet, which, by the way, just for the sake of Chazara on yesterday, we defined that it is the uppermost section of the esophagus, where the esophagus is attached to the jaw. So now Rava rules that this animal, where he began the shechita in the Turvat Saveshet, is treif. It's not during the shechita, because the Gemara said that if it was during the shechita, meaning if it was the area that's designated for shechita, then obviously you can't say it's treif b'masha, because then you basically invalidate every single shechita. So the chiddush here of Rava in ruling that this animal is treif is that this is considered a nekuvas haveshet, but has nothing to do with the fact that it's part of the location of shechita or it's outside the location of shechita. And Rava is saying that there are tzvei dinim. There's one din of veshet which tells you where to do the shechita, where you can do the shechita. There's another din of veshet with halacha of setting or paskening that the animal is a treifa applies even if it's outside of the location of shechita. It's beyond the location of the shechita. And by the way, Rashi points out that there's a parallel halacha in the Kana. We're talking now about the Veshet, but in the Kana also, where the psul, the treifa, is if it was cut more than half, there too, even if it was cut more than half at part of the kana which is outside of the area of shechita, nevertheless it would set up the animal as a treifa. So Rav is applying that now to Veshet. Now the Gemara wants to know, when you're setting a certain area for the shechita of the Veshet, lemalad kama, up until which point, as you go up the Veshet, up the esophagus towards the jaw, what point do you say is outside already the makom shchita? Omer Rav Nachman, ad kedei tfisas yad. In other words, take your hand and grab onto the esophagus on the top of the esophagus. Anything that's within the grasp of your hand is outside of the area designated for shchita. Okay, now we have the top of the area designated, the top of the esophagus, up to a hand's grasp. Now, what about the bottom? Lamatad kama. Or Rav Nachman, again Rav Nachman, but here he's saying in the name of Rabbi Bar Avua, ad kidei sheyasir. Now, the word yasir is a conjugation of se'ar, of hair. And at what point is it hairy? Apparently, on the bottom part of the esophagus, where there's a lining of the esophagus, it becomes hairy. So again, we have to take a crash course in anatomy here. But he says on the bottom that this has to do with the keres. And apparently, there's some point in the keres where I don't know exactly. He says it's minute hair-like processes known as papilia. Okay, I don't know. It's something that basically, if you want to eat the keres, then you got to scrape off this hair. These, I don't know what you call them. He calls them processes. Anyway, something that looks like hair has to be scraped off. Anyway, that's the bottom part of the esophagus where there's no shechita. So the Gemara finds a steer to this. Ve'eni, is that so? Va'omer avina, omer gniv meshvei derav. Tefach beveshet, samach lekeres, zehu keres apnimi. Right, we said that the keres, called in English a paunch, has an inner part and an outer part, as we discussed yesterday. And Ravina is recording in the name of Rav that the last tefach of the esophagus, which is the keres samuch. Samuch means adjacent to the keres hapnimi. Amai. Why is that so? In the light of what we saw in the name of Rabbi Bar Avua, ad kidei sheyasir, then we don't understand why Rabbi Bar Avua says that the shechita is only valid down to the point of sheyasir. I don't get it. Is ki kashachat v'kares kashachat? Rav says that the area that we now call sheyasir is in fact the keres, the inner paunch, and that shechita can't be kosher. So how can you tell me that you could shecht in the name of Rabbi all the way down to the yasir? That's already the area of the paunch, of the inner keres, and according to Rav, that's treif, because we know that the keres hapnimi is treif, and the slightest puncture in the keres hapnimi renders the animal a treifa. So the Gemara answers, Ema, we have to sort of rewrite Rav's understanding of the keres hapnimi. Tefach bekeres samach leveshet zeu keres hapnimi. So the Gemara's first answer is that a tefach of the keres hapnimi, meaning the veshet all the way down to the keres, is considered veshet. The keres hapnimi is not the last handbreadth, the last tefach of this veshet, but rather the first tefach of the keres itself. So therefore, you could do shchita all the way down to that misha yasir, where the veshet meets the keres, as we said, according to Rabbi Baravua. So it's not like we originally understood in reading Rav that the last tefach of the veshet is called the keres hapnimi. It's visibly distinct from the keres itself. So according to the new reading of Rav's definition, the reason why that tefach of the keres is called the keres hapnimi is because it's inside the rib cage. And here he has a whole picture of it. Ibai sent another answer. Kikama Rav betura de masir tfei. When Rav says that the last tefach of the veshet is the keres hapnimi, that's a separate halacha in a Torah. A Torah is an ox. Now, in the biology or the anatomy of an ox, we have that hairy stuff that we spoke about before. The processes go much higher. The hairy lining of the keres extends one tefach into the veshet. So only with regard to a Torah, the ox, that Rav defined the keres hapnimi as the last tefach in the veshet. But in general, for other animals, it's the first part of the hairy area, as we said. So in a smaller animal, for example, the hairy lining does not extend into the esophagus, and therefore the keres hapnimi doesn't begin until the beginning of the keres itself. Regard to shchita, the lower limit of the veshet is always the point where the hairy lining begins, and that was Rabbi Baravua. In the case of an ox, however, the shchita can be done until the last tefach before the keres. But in the case of the smaller animals, the shchita can be done until the keres itself. So I think, if I understand correctly, that with regard to other animals other than the ox, there's a lot more room on the esophagus, on the veshet, to do shchita. Amar Rav Nachman Amar Shmuel, Turbatz ha-veshet shenita al kulo milachi. If the entire area called the Turbatz ha-veshet, which, as we said before, is on the top of the veshet towards the jaw, which is called lechi or lechi, and apparently there's the lechi atachton, that's the bottom jaw, which is more connected to the veshet, to the esophagus. And if the entire turbatz haveshet was removed and it's no longer attached to the lechi atachton, the lower jaw, then kosher, the animal is not treif. And not only that, the Mishnah later on Daf Nun Dalit says that Nital Lechi Hatachton Kosher. So if the lower jaw is removed, and now we have a situation where the simonim are detached from the connection to the jaw, and yet the Mishnah says that the animal is kosher, which confirms that rule that the detachment of the turbatz of the Turbat Saveshet does not make it into a treifa. Maskif law Rav Papa, I don't get it. If the Turbat Saveshet on the top of the Veshet is detached from the jaw, then the two simonim are also detached. And or ikur simonim. One of the psulei shchita is ikur. And ikur means when you pull the simonim out of their place. So how can you tell me it's kosher? Frek the Gemara and Rav Papa, what are you going to do with the Mishnah? Will Rav Papa kasher masnisa nita lechi hatachton kosher? So the Gemara defends Rav Papa's kash. Bishleim masnisa Rav Papa lo kasha. How is the Mishnah different than the case which Shmuel, Paskin, and Rav Papa rejected? Hadi akur iakure. So now he's referring to the case of Shmuel. Then we'll get back to the Mishnah. Shmuel said, Turbat Saveshet Shenito Kulo Milechi Kosher. That's the Akur Ikure. Right? The two simana were completely uprooted. They're not attached anymore. So that's where Rav Papa is going to ask, well, then that's a psul of Ikur. How could Shmuel possibly be machshir the animal? Now we get to the Mishnah. Ha de igum igume me ilave simonim. Apparently, you can cut something from the lechi atachta on the lower jaw, and still leave behind you the two simonim intact. Why? Because apparently, if I understand correctly, what you removed in the Mishnah's case from the lower jaw was some sort of a flesh that surrounds the bones, and the simonim are still attached to that flesh. El Shmuel kasha, but Shmuel it's ikur, because in Shmuel's case, the entire turbat haveshet was removed, and if it became detached from the lower jaw, then there's ikur simonim. So the Gemara defends Shmuel and says, Lo tema kulo. Don't read Shmuel as saying. We have to rewrite the text of Shmuel. In our text, it says, Turbat Saveshet Shenit al Kulo Milechi. No. Hela Ema Rubo. So in other words, some of the Turbats Halechi, some of the Turbats Haveshet is still attached to the jaw, to the lower jaw. And if that be the case, then there's no ikur. The simonim are not uprooted because they're attached to that flesh of the lower jaw, that mute. The Gemara doesn't like it. Va'amar Rabba Baruch of Shmuel, another statement of Shmuel, simonim shenidal delu berubon treifa. The issue here is not ikur, because you don't have ikur because the simonim are not detached. But nevertheless, once most of the simonim are no longer in the place in the anatomy of the animal, then it's a problem of treifa. So you may have solved one problem, but you have another problem. And that's the problem of treifa. How can you say that Shmuel was matir in the case of nital turbat haveshet when most of it was detached? That animal is a treifa. So the Gemara answers, Omer Rav Shisha Bered Rav Idi, Ha de ichval ikpule, Hasam di parik afruke. So we're making distinctions in various cases here, very thin subtle distinctions. When Shmuel said that even if most of the turbat haveshet is detached from the jaw, nevertheless the animal is kosher. That's the case of ikpal ikfule. Literally translated as was peeled away. Right? Milashon liklof or kafal. So somehow the detached portion is still continuous. But in the case of Rabbi Bar Chana, in the name of Shmuel, where the majority of the simon became detached and therefore the animal is treif, that's a case of iparuk ifruke. It was separated not continuously, but discontinuously, a little bit here and a little bit there. And again, I'm going to just read what he says here. There's many, many paragraphs here. A discontinuous separation indicates that the separation occurred as a result of wrenching. And in such a case, even though the remainder is still attached, but nevertheless it's weakened by the force of the wrenching. And this separation would not heal, the animal is treif. But where the detached section is peeled away in a continuous line, the minority that remains attached is firmly attached as it was before. Therefore, it's not a treifa. And we can assume that there's enough of an attachment that this separation will heal. And therefore, the animal is mutter. So, in the final conclusion of the Gemara regarding the case of the separation of the turbat haveshet from the flesh of the lower jaw, if it remains mostly attached, the animal is kosher, the shechita is valid. If it's mostly detached as a result of peeling, the animal is kosher, the shechita is valid. If it's mostly detached as a result of some sort of wrenching, a forceful tug, the animal is treif. Okay, now we go back to the Mishnah, and the Mishnah says Psukas Hagargeres, another one of the 18 treifas listed in the Mishnah, is in the windpipe. Which is also called the trachea, as we said many times, but got to let it sink in. Tana, we learned in a brisa, Kama Psukas Hagargeres. Okay, you told me that the windpipe is severed. How much? Beruba. We know this already. But the Gemara is not sure exactly how do you calculate rove with regard to the kana. In which point you say that the animal is treif because the majority of the gargeres has been severed. And now we're up to Rav.